Philip, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
So you are, people may not know this, but you're actually in Singapore, aren't you? So tell us a story about how you ended up being in Singapore.
Right. So actually behind us, you see Singapore's most iconic public housing, which is actually where I live as well. Singapore is a unique societal approach. It's a country that has essentially built a reputation around being a trusted place for business. And I think increasingly also a trusted place for disruptive innovation. So I came here by chance, in fact, doing something with Singapore Management University in 2010. And to my point, I got so inspired. I learned about, quite a lot of new fields. And I found it very interesting how the pace of change here is just, something people are very comfortable with. And I like the fact that, here there was really always a conversation about possibility. And if you look at Southeast Asia as a region, right, this is the region where, people say, we'll call it the new world. So, US being the new world, Europe being the old world, this is the new world. And all of that kind of fascinated me quite a bit. So I decided to return and, I've been here based full time for quite a number of years now. And I have absolutely no intention to leave. So, yeah.
Good for you. That's wonderful. And it's interesting, you used the word trust a couple of times in your sentence there when you were describing in your description.
Yes.
Tell me what got you interested in trust as a concept,
right.
Concept's not the right word, is it? Tell me what you got interested in trust.
So it started really with me always having like a couple of characteristics that were a bit strange. Like I had lots of ideas, but most of these ideas were very crazy. I would read lots of very complicated books when I was quite young. And so I would be talking about stuff that most people didn't really know what I was going on about at the time. And at the time, not now, hopefully. No, but seriously, the other thing I noticed is that, I was always a lot younger than my peers. So I was always kind of the guinea pig. I finished university at 19. And in fact, people rightfully ask, what have you to contribute? Like, why should we listen to your crazy ideas? You're different, you're maybe a little bit more radical in your thinking, and you're much younger. So what's the reason for us? And I then also studied design thinking and human-centered innovation. And I realized that, wait a minute, it's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to change anything if people don't trust in you and in your ideas. And that's sort of when I had this eureka moment that, all change in the world, everything that we refer to as the present and in fact the future is a product of where we put our trust. And it's sort of a way that we vote with our trust how the future is going to look like. And that fascinated me. And it's almost like 8 years ago that happened.
I like that a lot. So it was your youth. That's really good. Tell me, what is your definition of trust?
So for me, it's basically about kind of a catalyst for value. So trust catalyzes value. I describe it as, value realized in socioeconomic interactions, which is basically just talking about trust as a form of capital. In fact, I think trust is a much more versatile form of capital still than money. And money so far to most people is, kind of the most versatile form of resource that they have. But trust is such that, it really allows you to make decisions confidently and quickly, and it allows you to essentially, create the future. So to me, that is the relationship that we need to associate with trust. And I find that trust is often considered an almost esoteric and intangible concept, but it's not, because it's the very fiber that connects humanity to each other. It's what makes us human, right? The fact that we establish, constructs based on trust, we establish nations and governments and societies, all based on our imagination and on trust in that imagination. That's what makes us unique. So it's very, very innately human. And of course, therefore, it's also innately important in the economy. It's just that nobody's really made it that tangible, I feel.
I like that. I really like that. And you're passionate about it. I can see and feel your passion. So tell me, talk me through the difference between trusted and trustworthy.
So there's an actually interesting body of research that shows when you ask people whether they trust something, they will usually tell you whether they think something is trustworthy. But if you really observe that, that's not really the question, right? The question is whether you trust something. And the reality is that trust is much more a function of behavior, as in where we put our money, how we spend our time, and who we give our data to, than it is of whether we think that approach is right. And this is also why I describe trust a bit like the force. You know, you can use the force for good, you can use it for bad if you're like a Vader, but in the end of the day, you know, whoever has the force is the one that has the power to change things. Or if, you know, if you happen to be an incumbent, you have the power to keep things the way you are. And in fact, this is interesting. If we look at trust as an economic force, because if I have an established business, I want to prevent it from being disrupted. The best bet I can have is being the most trusted in the market. And if I'm a startup and if I want to basically get into a market and into a space, then again, my best bet is to be trusted and to so to speak, steal that trust away from established solutions. And that's why I'm also quite fascinated with this topic, because it's really that universal connector that describes and rationalizes human behavior.
Really good. Yeah. Really, I want to go a bit deeper now and ask you, are there different types of trust?
So, okay, so, you know, most people will come to me initially and say, well, so trust, I mean, it's still very intangible. Make it tangible for me. And I will. In fact, the way I do usually is I say there is this thing that we associate with trust being hygiene. And, you know, this is what I call transactional trust. You tap your credit card on the terminal, you trust that that transaction is safe, right? That's a hygiene trust. You trust that the ceiling's not going to come down on you. You trust that when you walk on the street, you know, people won't shoot you, right? In most places, that's a hygiene form of trust that happens. Then there is a more interesting form of trust, which is a higher order, really. It's more valuable because everybody can cover the, you know, the hygiene aspect, right? That's pretty simple. The less easy bit is actually what I call expertise or expert trust. That's contextual trust, meaning, you know, it's the doctor basically that you trust for medical advice, hopefully, or, you know, it's ultimately the speaker agent that you trust to recommend you the best speaker, hopefully. So basically the idea is here, you trust the person for a specific set of activities. However, you might not ask your dentist for dating advice, right? So that trust is confined to a context. And then there's the third most relevant type of trust, which is also most valuable type of trust, which I call universal trust. This means that you trust a person or, you know, even a brand so much that you would take advice and kind of, you know, drive ultimately your decisions towards them in almost any capacity. So they could tell you, you know, to buy maybe a car, they could probably offer you a food blender, they could offer you services. You would just believe that they're so universally relevant and valuable to you that it doesn't matter what they offer you. This is kind of the trust we hopefully reserve for family. It's also the trust we reserve for the world's most valuable brands. Just imagine if a brand like Apple were to suddenly start doing kitchen equipment or were to start selling insurance. In fact, there's been a lot of debate about tech companies starting to sell increasingly services. They sort of borrow their trust from their established core business over to a new space. And this universal trust is by far the most valuable trust you can have. And that's also what, as a person, I believe you should be aspiring to. Because the most universally trusted people tend to also be the ones that do best economically and socially.
That's really interesting, the different types of trust. In your book, you actually propose a way to quantify trust. I mean, that's quite cool, isn't it? So can you explain that, or do we need to read the entire book to understand it?
I think there are two approaches. One is that every company is ultimately a sum of the activities it creates, right? So every company is like a swarm of individual tasks and processes and activities. And so my thesis is that, you know, if trust is a catalyst for value, that means each of these activities, by either, you know, catalyzing value or also maybe destroying value or, you know, taking value away, is actually either building trust or destroying trust. In fact, very simple example, you know, you have a refund from a customer and the person that is supposed to process that refund takes maybe over 7 days. That is what I would call a trust gap. Customer suddenly questions whether this company practices what it preaches, which is one of the stages of my trust model. So basically what you're saying there is you're looking at trust gaps along all the activities of a company. And then I look at basically the net effect of all the trust gaps and all the opportunities for trust building. And what I then do is I patch up the trust gaps and I basically, you know, amplify opportunities where more trust can be built. And the idea is that companies will come out there ultimately realizing more value for themselves and for their customers. This is the company approach. On an individual level, I actually look at trust as a multiple. So for example, you know, if you have a choice X, that's a commodity, right? But instead of X, you're actually willing to pay 2X for a certain good because you trust that it is the best option for you. And in fact, I call these things mental monopolies. If you buy, say, an iPhone, and sorry for using Apple as an example again, but a lot of people feel me with this, you trust it's the only phone that will fulfill your need. And it's sort of the best, in fact, if you think it's probably the only acceptable option for you. And that's what I sort of refer to as a mental monopoly, because it doesn't mean that you're a utilities company or a telco. In fact, you don't need to be just one of 2 or 3 players to create sort of monopolistic type of benefits. All you can do is actually create that monopoly in people's minds. And that you do by making people trust your proposition more than any other. And in fact, trusting it almost universally. And that to me is the ultimate competitive edge. That's where everybody wants to be.
Monopolies in people's minds. I like that. I like that. Really good. Okay. So, I mean, with regards to technology, though, that has to be changing what we trust and how we trust. And you talk about this actually in your speeches. Can you give us some examples of how technology is affecting how we trust?
So the first one is I don't know if you feel this, but when I travel, I'll be, trying to get a taxi and there's a taxi right in front of me. Yet the first thing I do is go on my app like Grab or Gojek, which is the big ones here, and I look for a taxi there or I look for a ride there. We sort of default to technology nowadays. And in fact, we trust technology will solve almost all of our problems because in the last 10, 20 years, we've had this unprecedented innovation, coming through technology. And I think to the extent that, we also date online, we buy houses online, we buy cars online, we buy diamonds online for our spouses, we basically have shifted our default behavior to the online world. And in fact, we are now more willing than ever to trust strangers, which I explain in a very sort of, anthropological way, that humans are wired to trust. And so technology has simply been able to return us to a space where we can build trusted tribes with other people, based on reputation systems and based on data. Because the nice thing about this is that data and reputation systems create a trail of evidence and they create context. And that context actually allows us to trust people because we see an environment, and it allows us actually to create these self-regulating communities. And it turns out that these communities are far more effective in ensuring compliance than traditional rules or centralized institutions. And this is an actual revolution going on there, because it means we're completely changing the way we're organizing our social and economic activities as a species. And that is profound. That is a huge thing happening right now. Trust is at the very heart of it. And in fact, if you haven't picked up on it, look at all the articles out there right now that refer to rebuilding trust, tech companies having a trust problem. All of these things are ultimately people finally rationalizing and realizing that trust is super important in our day-to-day life. And that, it has actually shifted to technology as a default.
That's fascinating, because aren't we just getting less personal, though, through technology and with technology?
I guess in some ways one could say that. And I think that's usually the generational argument, that the younger generation always has kind of, less of an idea of what's going on. But realistically speaking, right, what we're seeing is a sort of relationship renaissance. That's a term I stole from The Human Brand, which is a fabulous book about how we look at brands as humans. So, we hate our service provider and we love, the bakery downstairs. That it's basically, we react to brands as humans, which shows that, we are so deprived of humanity in a global, capitalized, anonymous system that we kind of want to reestablish that. In fact, technology has made us more personal because it has allowed us to build trust and personal relations with others at scale. And in fact, this has often provided informal networks for us to get work done more effectively or to build connections more effectively. In other words, if you look at any modern corporation right now, a lot of work gets done informally. A lot of work gets done on social media. A lot of work gets done in groups. And, of course, most companies are concerned about this because it's not essentially part of their policy. But there's a reason for this. The corporate world has not kept up with our needs. And in fact, it has sort of tried to make us into human machines. Now I think there is sort of this age of liberation where we're starting to reprioritize trust, reprioritize relationships, and figure out that we can have all the benefits of a capitalist globalized market, but we can get rid of the drawbacks with technology and by trusting new things and by trusting each other in new ways. And to me, that is the most powerful thing that we can possibly do, because it just means returning to a more humane economy. and hopefully to an economy that is more equal, that is more concerned, and that's also more sustainable and ethical. And who doesn't want that, right? Who doesn't want that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I love the optimism that's coming out here. That's great. It's good to hear. So looking on a slightly negative point of view, though, I mean, you talked about examples of people buying houses online and buying cars online and buying diamonds online. But will some established businesses be threatened by this?
So, I mean, I spent a lot of time doing transformation inside large financial services firms. Specifically, we were looking at life insurance and investments for the future, retirement policies. These are all very intangible things that, you know, traditionally had to be sold and provided with a lot of hand-holding. And of course, it is dangerous when people buy these things and make these commitments online. But realistically, you know, that has been a process. So the less tangible something is, the less easy it is to sell online. However, there's a flip side to that as well, which is that, of course, you know, whereas we maybe overestimate the pace at which change is happening, you know, most companies say, oh, it's not really a threat to our business yet because our core business is mostly still physical. We tend to underestimate, you know, the actual magnitude of the change. And in fact, this goes with almost any industry. So to me, the very simple way of looking at this is, right, if you are not present in the digital realm, you will be present. It's just that you won't have control over your presence. People will talk about you. People will leave reviews. You will be having digital touch points, even if you refuse to accept that. So the question is just, how much control do you want to take? And then it gets more complicated because nowadays we can't really control what people talk about us, right? We can't necessarily limit it. So even when you are present, you know, you will have to deal with majorly more uncertainty than in the past. So basically the best bet you have really, and I say this honestly, is to be the absolute best you can be. And this to me is also the advice I would, you know, give only if requested to anybody who says, well, my job will be lost by AI or will my job be lost by technology? I say, if you are competent, if you are the best among what you do, I think that you have every right to believe that you will be able to add value in the future. However, if you are not in any way competent, or if you have issues trying to keep up, then possibly you will have a risk. So to me, this is important because excellence, I think, is, you know, an often abused word, but if you really look at kind of what digital has done, it has created way more choices than we ever had before. It's created way more competition than we ever had before. But there's a giant opportunity in all that noise is to be the one or two choices that stand out. Almost nobody stands out. And almost everything has become accessible and commoditized. So make sure that you are that one that actually puts a stake in the ground, that acts differently, you know, that has a proposition and an experience that is truly unique, that runs the company in a unique way, you know, that has a unique culture. All of these things will majorly differentiate you, but they're not going to be possible using the same tools that you used in the past, because those tools by right are normative. In fact, they make you like any other company in the world. It's the compliance and KPIs and rule overload that we all have to deal with at work all the time. That's not going to be the solution. A better way of doing it is to understand what's happening and how the digital economy is changing and shifting paradigms, and potentially try and learn from that and try and adapt yourself to that. If you don't, you know, you'll evolve slower than others, and we all know where that leads, right?
Absolutely. There's so much. I mean, that was a masterclass in an answer. I love that. There's so much there that I really agree. I'm cheering and saying yes, 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 yes. Absolutely. So let me talk about intermediaries, because I'm an intermediary. And I hope I'm what you would call a trust intermediary, you know, as a speaker booker, as a bureau agent, whatever you want to call it. So what's the future going to look like for people like me? Obviously I'm excellent and I'm competent and I'm a control freak.
Absolutely.
So how will it look?
So I think, you know, there was a baseline saying, you know, nobody ever got fired for hiring the big four or hiring the big technology providers. That's the first step. So in the first instance, good trust intermediaries are an insurance policy against failure. And, you know, I used to spend a lot of time in the insurance space. There is certainly a business there. Yeah. Insuring against the risk is great because none of us likes the downsides. And in fact, we overestimate, you know, what that's going to do to us. So generally we like, in business, we play it safe. And in fact, that's great. Risk taking where it can be avoided will be avoided. But that's only the hygiene factor. In fact, nowadays, the role of a great intermediary is about really sifting through this exploding complexity in the world. You know, even in the speaker world, there are more speakers than ever before. And in fact, we're living in this age of empowerment. Everybody, goes like, okay, I'm going to start an e-commerce thing. I'm going to sort of become a speaker. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to freelance. I'm going to be a nomad. That's okay, never mind. It's probably my story. Anyway, and basically that means, there's way more information to sift through. And I think, again, like if you know what you're doing and if you're good at what you do, the internal algorithm that you have and your ability to find the right content and match it with the right opportunities, that makes you a great intermediary. However, I will say that, part of my book kind of puts this on the table as well, that the future is going to be owned by digital trust intermediaries, because those are starting to make, decisions for us on a daily basis. We trust digital trust intermediaries for almost everything. So coming and taking your expertise and coming online with that expertise, using technology to do all the annoying parts, the machine tasks, that to me is also the future of intermediary business models, because relationship building, finding the right answer, and also the unique human ingenuity of being able, to match the right people, that is an absolutely essential skill. And that's a creative skill. That's an abstract skill. That's a skill that requires context. And frankly, excuse me for saying this, it requires humanity. So those who will be able to excel at that will continue to excel in the future. In fact, to make this very, very geeky now, if you know the online travel management space, the OTA space, right? People said, oh, you know what, OTAs are disintermediating travel. It's not true, because when we used to have these small mom and pop, travel agencies, they basically started consolidating into these giant trust intermediaries that mainly do business online. To me, the speaking world is probably going to face a similar situation, that some of the most powerful and influential players will associate and then will move into these global players that basically use technology to facilitate their business. And then account management, relationship building and relationship management, that's still a human domain. So I think we're just going to change a little bit our aggregate state of how, the industry of, intermediation will work. But there is definitely going to be an intermediary. It's just that every intermediary, kind of changes form after a while based on the tech possibilities and how the world is evolving. And I think that is an optimistic but realistic perspective to indulge.
Okay, well, that leads me really nicely on to my next question, and thank you for that. In that, you say that the trust economy equals a happy economy. So is that because, well, actually, I'm not going to answer it. Why is that? Explain that to me?
So, there is some emerging research that kind of links trust and oxytocin. In fact, oxytocin is a hormone that's mainly, attributed to well-being, to feeling belonging in a group. But that research is somewhat inconclusive as of this point. So, there's a lot of research out there. And what I usually say is that it does, kind of promote our sense of belonging and our sense of place and our sense of contentment. And I think that, just needs to be seen in the world that we live in right now, where distrust is the status quo, where in fact everybody sort of second guesses each other. Contracts are nothing but, institutionalized kind of distrust, right? So basically in the business world, we constantly assume the other person is trying to screw us over, just as a safety thing. In the same way, when we go travel somewhere, right? Just because there is maybe 0.1% of bad guys, 99.9%, kind of have to actually go through the same security check and get rid of their shoes and belt. I do this kind of several times a month. So it really is a topic close to heart. Point here being is, to me, if we can figure out how technology can streamline trust building so that we can move away from rules that are just getting in the way of our experience and of getting things done, and we actually achieve the same level of trust and a higher level of compliance with a significantly more streamlined process where we don't have to deal with all this bureaucracy and all these roadblocks, then to me, it's pretty obvious that that's going to make life pretty amazing. And that's even before we look at the biology of it, which is that people generally prefer to trust each other. The problem with trusting is that when you trust and somebody else takes advantage of that, then obviously, that's pretty bad for you. So what we need to do is ensure that we build systems that rely on these innate human dimensions to build self-regulating communities and to basically take them from the small tribal communities that humans used to live in to a sort of global scale. And technology is just about starting to show the opportunities. But what that means is also that we will reorganize organizations. We will reorganize how companies work. We will, challenge the role of centralized institutions, because why do we need centralized institutions if we can just use technology to connect us more intuitively, right? So there are a lot of big questions that we need to ask. And then once we've asked these questions, we also need to get real and say that nothing in the world ever changes unless trust shifts away from the way things are today. And in fact, there's one thing that bureaucracy and the status quo are absolutely excellent at, which is self-preservation. They will do anything. They're engineered to keep things the way they are. So we got to get very real and say, how can we break that cycle? How can we get through to a point where we can actually move the needle, where we can actually move things forward? And then I am absolutely sure that we will live in a happier world. Just think about all the opportunity that is lost by people wasting time, wasting money, not finding the right connections, not finding the right business, and kind of being constantly caught up in admin or these sort of distrust enforcement tasks. I think trillions of dollars of productivity and also of ultimately fulfillment will be freed up, right? So to me, the future economy, if we build it on trust, is actually a much more desirable place to be. And in fact, it's also a necessary place to be, because if you look at the state of the world right now, we can't keep consuming the resources of that planet the way we are doing it right now. So to me, we have to become more effective. We have to completely challenge the way we organize our world. And hopefully we will be doing it in such a way that, humanity will be better for it.
That sounds wonderful. I love that. Thank you. So we've already come to our end of our time, which is amazing, because there are so many other questions I can ask you. But I'm going to do what I do. Normally, I put a speaker in my time machine and I take them back. But I'm tempted to take you forward today instead, rather than take you back. I'd like to take you forward and say to you, what do you see as a speaker, your role becoming? How do you see clients changing what they ask of you as a speaker? Can you do that for me?
Sure. I mean, to me, sort of, one of the things that I've started doing is I've started building a portfolio of companies that actually attaches to each of my core passion topics, which means that I'm actually talking the talk, and then I'm also walking the talk with my own money. And this becomes crucial because, to me, speaking is about changing the way things are done and creating a different kind of world. And it's about the impulses and also the pragmatic execution of that will make this happen. So to me, in, let's say 5 to 10 years time, that ambition of building a portfolio of companies that walk the talk, each of those companies will have had impact in their industry. Each of those companies will have had made lives better. And that to me gives me the ultimate fulfillment, to show that, each of them will also in some way or another build a more trusted future. And each of them will prove and build, the first or maybe one of the initial, kind of proofs of concept and hopefully proofs of value that this is possible. And the best thing in the world is when people copy that, because that is the way the world changes. A few bold minds go ahead, do something different. People see it working, everybody will start following. And to me, that is fabulous, because that is the way the world changes. The moment that more people are starting to demonstrate that sustainability is great for business, other people will follow suit. The moment we start showing that a world in which we have more trust is better, other people will start contributing to building it. And this is obviously the mission of why I travel around the world, spreading that message and helping people make it real.
I love that. What a wonderful place to end. Philipp, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria.